At dawn on May 20th, 1927, the Spirit of St. Louis is made ready for takeoff. Its pilot and sole occupant will be 25-year-old Charles Lindbergh, who plans to fly from Roosevelt Field, Long Island, to Paris, France, non-stop. The Spirit of St. Louis is carrying 450 gallons of fuel. The runway is wet and soft. The plane doesn't want to leave the ground. If Lindbergh can clear the power lines at the end of the runway, he has a chance to fly into immortality. The Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum is the most visited museum in the world. Its collection contains some of the most important aircraft and spacecraft in history. Craft that were designed, built, and flown by men and women who have expanded the frontiers of flight. The Spirit of St. Louis is a unique airplane. It was built in just 60 days by the Little Ryan Company in San Diego for the use of one man on one great journey. The man was Charles Lindbergh, and his vision was to fly solo from New York to Paris and claim a prize of $25,000. The Spirit was a variation of the Ryan Company's line of mail planes, but it had a bigger wing, a new Wright Whirlwind radial engine, and a tremendous fuel capacity. The main fuel tank was in between the engine and the cockpit, and there was no windshield. There were two reasons for that. One was that the tank was on a center of gravity, so as fuel was used, the airplane would remain balanced. The other was that Lindbergh didn't want to be caught between the engine and the fuel tank if there was an accident. So Lindbergh's only forward vision was through a small periscope that projected out of the side of the airplane. Unlike his competitors, he planned to make the trip alone. This is the story of Charles Lindbergh, the Spirit of St. Louis, and their legendary journey. In the years after World War I, aviation looked for a way to remain economically viable. One possibility was entertainment. Daredevil races against automobiles thrilled crowds, and courageous or foolhardy individuals came up with imaginative ways to interact with airplanes. The more difficult and dangerous the stunt, the better. The airplanes provided a way of doing many things that had previously been impossible. The world was changing rapidly. In the middle 1920s, the American sporting public was marveling at the feats of Red Grange, the galloping ghost. But a sporting hero wasn't enough to satisfy the need of a nation trying to come to terms with change.
There was a lot of uncertainty in American culture, in particular during the 1920s. There were all sorts of new ideas floating around. Machines were doing more and more work. Old limits seemed to be vanishing.
Change was everywhere. Bathing beauty contests presented women to the public in a way that was completely new.
And here came this character Lindbergh, who sort of, I think, again, married the old virtues, those old 19th century virtues, with, the capacity to fly, to control this machine.
Lindbergh was part of the post-war urge to live life to the fullest. As a young pilot of 21, he had flown for a wing walker, making mid-air plane-to-plane transfers. Airmail began in America in the late months of World War I. By 1925, the service had expanded to cover much of the continent. The problems of flying at night and in bad weather led to the lighting of many airfields. By 1925, $1.25 million had been spent by the U.S. government on lights to make night flying safer. But the job of a male pilot was still hazardous. When Charles Lindbergh became a male pilot, he flew a de Havilland DH-4. In 1926, as chief pilot for Robertson Aircraft in St. Louis, Missouri, he initiated the mail service between St. Louis and Chicago. Even though more fields were being lit, male pilots were still at the mercy of weather, and the parachutes they carried were frequently put to use. Charles Lindbergh would deliberately fly at night in bad conditions to sharpen his skill at using only instruments. But more than once he had to bail out, and on one mission his DH-4 followed him down, coming close to hitting him as it spiraled to Earth. The Atlantic fascinated Lindbergh. He felt he was capable of flying from America to Europe if only he had the airplane to do it. He was sure the Atlantic weather could be no worse than the conditions he'd become used to on his night mail flights. Even though the Atlantic had been crossed a number of times by air since the end of World War I, there was still one major goal that hadn't been achieved. No one had flown between America and Europe nonstop, and the $25,000 prize offered in 1919 for the achievement was still unclaimed. In September 1926, French ace René Fonck made an attempt from Roosevelt Field in New York, but his Sikorsky trimotor crashed and burned on takeoff. With the backing of a group of businessmen from St. Louis, Lindbergh approached the Belanca Company in New York for an airplane powered by a single right whirlwind motor that he could fly across the Atlantic by himself. Other manufacturers had already rejected Lindbergh's idea, but Giuseppe Belanca agreed on the condition that he select the pilot. That would leave no role for Lindbergh. Lindbergh didn't like the idea.
He was absolutely furious. He grabbed his check off the desk and went back to St. Louis, and he said, well, now we're going to try the Ryan Company. He said, that's the only company we know that's left.
As a male pilot, Charles Lindbergh had heard of Ryan Airlines in San Diego. They built successful mail planes, and a design based on their cabin plane, the Bluebird, was about to go into production. This is the building that housed Ryan Airlines in 1927. Georgia Borthwick, then Georgia Mathias, worked here as a secretary.
And one day when I was on the switchboard, this telegram came from Western Union. It came from the Robertson Company in St. Louis, and they said, can you build airplane capable of flying the Atlantic with right whirlwind motor, state, price, and delivery date?
The Ryan Airlines building was an old fish cannery. T. Claude Ryan, the company's founder, had recently sold the business to B. Franklin Mahoney, Georgia's boss.
And so I showed the telegram to Mr. Mahoney, and he laughed. I think he thought it was kind of a joke. And pretty soon Mr. Ryan sauntered into the room, and he said, hey, Claude, look what we got. Isn't that crazy? He was just ready to throw it in the wastebasket. And Ryan said, hey, he said, why don't we get a hold of Donald Hall, our chief engineer? I think that maybe he can work something out on that.
Donald Hall's quick calculations indicated that an existing Ryan design could be adapted to carry the required amount of fuel, but the new airplane would need a larger wing and stronger landing gear. Lindbergh traveled to San Diego to supervise the design and building.
Lindbergh went right out to the field and didn't waste any time. He said, "Can I take up one of those airplanes?" And the fellas, "I'm Lindbergh from St. Louis," and he said, "Okay." So he got in the airplane and he took it up and flew it all over. And Mahoney saw his airplane just going through all sorts of stunts, and he said, "My God, who is that up in that airplane?" And he said, "Oh, that's that young kid from St. Louis, Lindbergh."
At first, Ryan Airlines thought they could build the airplane for $6,000, substantially less than Lindbergh and his backers had budgeted. The pressure of the transatlantic competition dictated that the job had to be completed in 60 days. This is the loft in the old fish cannery where the wings of the Ryan mail planes were built. Today, it's part of the big Solar Turbines plant. But when Lindbergh arrived in San Diego, the smell of dead fish was still noticeable. He was less than impressed. As Lindbergh talked to Donald Hall, it became clear that simply adapting existing designs wouldn't work. Much of the airplane would need to be built from scratch. The agreed price was $10,580. The race was on. In Paris, Captain Charles Nungesser announced his intention to fly the Atlantic with Francois Colli.
Well, the talk around the company was that they were going to do the very best job they could, and they were putting in a lot of overtime. They were very, very dedicated to making this airplane just as safe as they possibly could.
As the project got underway, Lindbergh and Hall worked long hours. For relaxation, Lindbergh would take a plane and fly around San Diego, often carrying one of the company workers as a passenger. In the end, Georgia was one of the few who hadn't flown, a fact which didn't escape the notice of sales manager A.J. Edwards. Edwards shared his bachelor apartment with Lindbergh, saving Lindbergh the $2.50 a day he would otherwise have had to pay for a hotel. Edwards got it into his head that Georgia should fly with Lindbergh.
I was pretty young, and airplanes just weren't, I didn't think they were here to stay. And so one day, Mr. Edwards said to me, "Georgia, you haven't flown with Slim, have you?" And I said, "No, I don't think I want to. He stunts." And he said, "Well, he won't if you don't want him to." I said, "Well, okay." Imagine me hesitating to fly with Lindbergh. So he said, "Slim, will you get an airplane and ready for warm it up for Georgia?" So he warmed up a great big airplane and put me in it, and he flew me all around Mission Bay and over San Diego City, and we landed. He didn't say a word. He was very quiet, but I thanked him, and it was a beautiful, wonderful, smooth flight. I wasn't the least bit frightened.
One of the workforce at the fish cannery at the time was Ed Morrow, a young man who had come from Oregon to work for Ryan.
Don Hall and Lindbergh went together to the library where they had this large kind of a globe, bigger than ordinaries, and they took the string and they put it at a certain spot near Nova Scotia to Paris, and then they checked that route on the map that string made, and that was the map that he flew by.
Lindbergh's total budget for the transatlantic attempt was $15,000. He knew that his rival Byrd had a budget of $100,000. Now word reached San Diego that a big Keystone Pathfinder was being built in New York for a new competitor, Lieutenant Commander Noel Davis. The American Legion had put up $100,000 to finance his attempt. But the generous budgets of his rivals didn't deter Lindbergh. His concentration on the task of preparing his attempt was complete.
Lindbergh would be at our office every day, and he'd be talking with mechanics and the pilots, but he wasn't really an exceptionally friendly person, especially with women. During the time that he was living with Mr. A.J. Edwards, who was kind of a roue, he tried to get him to go out on a couple of dates, but Lindbergh wasn't the least bit interested.
Lindbergh's rivals had their problems. Clarence Chamberlain was making the Atlantic attempt in a Belanca. On takeoff for a preliminary flight, his left landing gear collapsed. He had to land on one wheel. Commander Richard Byrd's preparations almost ended in disaster when his big Fokker trimotor came in for a landing. Amazingly, the damage could be repaired. Byrd was still in the race. Lindbergh was very aware of the difficulty of what he was attempting. He knew that having an airplane capable of completing the task was not enough. He must prepare himself as well.
During the time when he was there, he was very serious, and he would walk the beaches trying to stay awake at night to test himself for the flight.
We went down here where the Strand was, and he'd walk down the Strand. I don't think he ever did go clear to the lower end of it, but he'd walk down and turn around and walk back. And he might do that 2 or 3 times. You know, instead of getting too far either way, well, he'd just go to a certain place and turn around and come back. He'd spend several hours a night just keeping himself awake by walking.
The seriousness of the transatlantic race was underlined on April 26th. Noel Davis and his co-pilot Stan Worcester were killed when they crashed their Pathfinder on landing. By now, work on Lindbergh's airplane was well advanced. Lindbergh had supervised the building with meticulous attention to detail. On April 27th, the completed fuselage was brought out into the light of day.
We raised the tail up and backed the car under in such a way that we set it right down on the back of the seat. Had Doug Corrigan sat down there watching it and had it tied in such a way that it wouldn't jar loose. And we got our picture taken and all sitting there before we started. Me on the passenger side of the seat, and McNeil at the wheel, and Doug Corrigan under the tail. Here we go.
The loft where Ryan's wings were built was on the 2nd floor. The finished wings were always taken down the stairway, but the wing of Lindbergh's airplane was bigger, and on the way downstairs, it ran into an unforeseen problem.
We got this one part down, and it got stuck. And we didn't dare to let loose because it got worse stuck. So, hey, more help, more help. They few come over and begin to grab on here and there because it was pretty heavy for us at that angle. And we finally freed it and we started back upstairs with it. Was that something? Oof.
Fortunately, there was a railroad track beside the factory, and someone had the idea that a boxcar positioned under the window would serve as a platform for the wing.
Within minutes, that car was there, and we were standing in the window and we're motioning for him where to put the rear end of it, because when we put the wing out, we had to go out at an angle. So it wasn't the easiest thing in the world, but it could be worked by being very careful. And after a certain amount of scramble and being careful where you stepped and everything, we had that thing lengthways on the top of that car.
When the wing was resting securely on the car, a crane was brought in to lift it through the next stage of the operation.
We lifted it up and was holding it there. The crane was just holding it, and then we pushed the car out from under it.
With the boxcar out of the way, the wing could be lowered onto the flatbed dolly that would take it to the airfield on Dutch Flats.
We started lowering it, and then we backed the truck in that the wing was to go onto so that we could lower it down and set it on those blocks with padding on it, and then secure it in such a way that it could be hauled to the field.
It was now 59 days since work on the airplane began. The wing was to be attached to the fuselage. Then the Spirit of St. Louis would be complete. It happened as scheduled on the 60th day.
We bring the fuselage out, we lower the wing down and get out here with enough people under it to hold it up and shove the fuselage back under it. Doug Corrigan was the one that moved it from the tail. He'd raised the tail. It wasn't very heavy yet. And we got it in their position and started lowering it down. There's our pictures showing us holding the wing up, lowering it down on the fuselage. And when we got it set in position, and they put some punches in to hold it there, and then we let the tail down on the ground, and then we backed it out and swung it around with the tail toward the road.
The Spirit of St. Louis was now ready for its first test flight. Watched anxiously by the Ryan Company workers who had built it, Charles Lindbergh climbed into the brand new cockpit.
Lindbergh got in the seat and switch off, switch off. Okay, switch on. Walk up there. It took right off the first sternum swing. It started, and at first he just let it run kind of idling a little bit more than idling. And I think he kind of played with it about 5 minutes. Lindbergh taxied it out. Did he fool around with it, playing with it, to see how it felt? No. He just kept going and went right on up, just as if he'd been flying that dang plane day after day, and it looked like it. As far as it looked, him taking off there, why, heck, it looked like he'd been flying a steady.
A U.S. Navy pilot from the station at North Island saw the Spirit flying, and curious, he began to follow close on Lindbergh's tail.
Lindbergh saw him. He was right on his tail, and he couldn't get it off of his tail. Lindbergh stuck right there. Whatever that guy did, Lindbergh was right there.
The Spirit of St. Louis was inherently unstable because the wing had been made bigger without increasing the tail surface. Lindbergh had anticipated the instability and welcomed it because he thought he would be less likely to fall asleep if he had to be alert every inch of the way to Paris. On May 8th, while Lindbergh was still testing the Spirit, his rivals, Nungesser and Coley, took off from Paris to fly the Atlantic. They were never seen again. Flight tests on the Spirit of St. Louis continued, measuring speed and studying the ability of the airplane to take off with large amounts of fuel. Lindbergh's attempt was publicized in the national press. Across the continent, people began to follow his progress.
Of course, we all knew this race was coming off. It was in the newspapers about everything that they did, all of the different pilots, Admiral Byrd and Chamberlain and you name them, the Frenchman that made an attempt and failed to get here and passed, perished in the sea, the Atlantic. And this fellow, Lindbergh, was going to go by himself in this little Ryan monoplane. And there was even an effort to try to stop him because it was impossible for a person to go alone and that sort of thing.
The crew at Ryan Airlines had done their job. In 2 months of dedicated work, they had built an airplane that was virtually a flying fuel tank, as capable as anything then available of crossing the Atlantic. They fully realized the difficulty of what Lindbergh was facing, but they had come to know him as a young man of quiet determination. They knew that succeed or fail, he would stick to the task. Ryan Airlines held a farewell dinner to send Lindbergh on his way.
And he went all the way through saying goodbye to everybody in the factory, and I was the last one before he went out the side door.
In spite of his maturity, Lindbergh was naive about what faced him. He asked Mahoney how much the fare would be to get him from Le Bourget Airport into the city of Paris. Throughout the job of building the Spirit of St. Louis, Lindbergh had worked closely with Donald Hall, Ryan Airlines' designer. Hall had been as much of a perfectionist as Lindbergh in making sure that the Spirit was light, strong, and streamlined enough to meet its objective. On May 10th, the weather was right, and Lindbergh took off to fly to New York.
First thing he did, he come and circled over the factory. And then he made a big circle over town, and then he headed a little bit northeast. And you could tell that he was climbing kind of slow, but then he was still gaining a little altitude.
As the workers at Ryan Airlines wondered what they would do now, Lindbergh was already beginning to break records. He reached St. Louis in 14.5 hours. After a day, he flew on to New York, also in record time. There had been some wild talk about Lindbergh, and there was an impression that his airplane was just something that had been thrown together in a hurry. Lindbergh's view was different. He believed he had the best possible machine to attempt the Atlantic crossing. This is an old racetrack parking lot in Long Island, New York. It's the site of old Roosevelt Field, where Lindbergh and his rivals Byrd and Chamberlain waited for the weather to break. Byrd had a special 5,000-foot grass runway constructed to give the necessary distance for takeoff with a heavy load. Lindbergh was determined to be the first to leave. He watched the weather, looking for an opportunity.
This is a man who just had America written all over him. Born in Detroit, growing up on a farm in the Middle West. His father's a congressman, so he has all of these connections. I think people looked at him and, they saw the all-American boy. They saw the boy next door, the boy they wanted their daughter to meet. He just looked so perfect at the time of that flight.
Lindbergh's mother was extremely proud and protective of her son. She joined him in New York to see him off. Commander Byrd gave Lindbergh permission to use his special runway. It was a generous and sporting gesture from a rival for a $25,000 prize and world immortality. For days, conditions were bad. On the evening of May 19th, Lindbergh decided that the weather over the Atlantic would be favorable. That night he was kept awake by a friend and didn't sleep. At 4 in the morning, the Spirit of St. Louis was pulled out of the hangar in the wind and the rain. It was loaded with fuel, 451 gallons. Byrd's grass runway had been made soggy by the rain. At a weight of 5,130 pounds, just getting the Spirit of St. Louis in the air would be an achievement. Lindbergh had no parachute. He had 5 sandwiches and some candy bars. Commander Byrd wished him good luck. He told him they'd meet in Paris. At 7:51 in the morning, the chocks were pulled away. The ground was so soggy that the Spirit of St. Louis would hardly move. Spectators helped by pushing, and gradually it gained momentum. At the end of the runway, there was a line of telephone wires and trees. The Spirit of St. Louis must leave the ground in time to clear them. On that damp and dismal morning, the spectators watched Charles Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis struggle along the soggy runway, severely testing the strength of the landing gear. It took a very long time to bounce into the air and stay there. The first objective was achieved. The Spirit of St. Louis, with its lone pilot and 450 gallons of fuel, was in the air. They cleared the telephone lines by 20 feet. Lindbergh set his course for Nova Scotia, flying low above the waves. It was turbulent, and he was concerned that the wings wouldn't cope with a violent flexing. Over Nova Scotia, he ran into a thunderstorm, which he battled for half an hour before the wind changed and the weather calmed. Already he was feeling cramped and tired. His lack of sleep the night before troubled him. He was carrying no radio. He had only basic navigation instruments. He intended to rely on dead reckoning, calculating wind speed and direction from the behavior of the waves. There were over 3,000 miles to go, and his target was very small. Alone in the cockpit, with the engine droning on, he fought the urge to sleep. The Spirit of St. Louis demanded his constant attention. Fuel management alone was critical. He had to maintain the balance of the airplane by switching from tank to tank as the fuel was consumed.
My eyes feel as hard and dry as stones. If I could throw myself down on a bed, I'd be asleep in an instant.
To keep himself awake, he stamped on the floorboards and flexed his arms and legs.
The worst part about fighting sleep is that the harder you fight, the more you strengthen your enemy, and the more you weaken your resistance to him.
Apart from the instrument panel in front of him, he had nothing to stimulate his sight. Because of the big fuel tank, there was no forward visibility, and the periscope, the idea of a young worker at the Ryan plant, was only useful on the ground. All night, he fought sleep.
I let my eyelids fall shut for 5 seconds, then raised them against tons of weight, protesting they won't open wide until I force them with my thumb and lift the muscles of my forehead to keep them in place.
Ice formed on the wings, and he had to change course to avoid the clouds. His compasses behaved strangely, and he wasn't sure of his position. The dawn came.
The uncontrollable drive for sleep falls over me in quilted layers. This is the hour I've been dreading. I know it's the morning of my greatest test, the third morning since I slept. There's no alternative but death and failure.
20 hours out from New York, he descended below cloud to check his position. He was concerned that changes of course may have led to navigation errors. He began to imagine that he was south of his destination.
I'm capable only of holding my plane aloft, and laxly pointed toward a heading I set some hours ago. No extra energy remains.
He struck himself hard with his fist to keep awake.
There is no alternative but death and failure.
Slowly, his strength returned.
I've been hanging over the chasm of eternity, holding on to the ledge with my fingertips. But now I'm gaining strength. I'm crawling upward. Consciousness is coming back.
After 28 hours, he thought he saw land, but he'd already been fooled by one mirage and was reluctant to believe his eyes. But it was land. He checked his map. It was the Irish west coast at Dingle Bay. He was only 3 miles off his planned course and 2.5 hours ahead of schedule. At Le Bourget Airport in Paris, a crowd began to gather even though he was still hours away.
It's like rain after drought, spring after a northern winter. I'd been to eternity and back. I know how the dead would feel to live again.
"33 hours, 30 minutes, and 29.9 seconds after he started out, he landed in front of a vast crowd at Le Bourget and had to taxi through their welcoming rush. 2 French aviators and a Belgian baron hid him in a darkened hangar. His ordeal in the wicker seat of the Spirit of St. Louis was over, and his life was changed beyond his imagining. The following morning, he stood on the balcony of the United States Embassy in Paris and accepted the adulation of the crowd. Back in the United States, the news had reached San Diego. The Ryan Company workers paraded in the main street, and the city joined in the celebration. B. Franklin Mahoney planned a trip to Paris, and Donald Hall, the designer, walked along the beach by himself, contemplating Lindbergh's achievement.
Lots of people had gone over the Atlantic before him, but he'd done it alone, and with a lot of flair, and under the right circumstances. And I think it's that sets the flight apart more than anything else. The sort of special spin that Lindbergh's character and personality and persona put on that flight. Lindbergh, made himself immortal.
Oh, I think it was unbelievable that a man, especially that he didn't sleep the night before and managed to stay awake and fly for 33.5 hours and hit the Irish coast a few miles from where he planned to hit it and run through bad weather and everything. It was an unbelievable achievement in my opinion.
Lindbergh's first decoration was the French Legion of Honor, presented by President Doumergue. In these pictures, his eyes reveal the effect of lack of sleep, followed by the enormous demands of celebrity. But Lindbergh didn't relax. He departed from Paris for the first leg of what was to be a very long, triumphal tour. He landed at Brussels in Belgium for another round of welcome, honors, and a taste of pomp and circumstance. In just a few days, the world of Charles Lindbergh had undergone a radical transformation. But the man himself remained calm and self-effacing, even with a wild crowd of 150,000 people and uncontrolled air traffic welcoming him to Croydon Airport in England. Lindbergh had given the world a glimpse of the real potential of air travel. The fact that he had done it alone in a single-engine airplane endowed him with legendary status. Suddenly, the doors of the mighty and powerful were thrown open. America sent the cruiser U.S.S. Memphis to bring him home. The trip back across the Atlantic was Lindbergh's first opportunity to relax since leaving New York. He made the most of it. The Memphis was bound for Washington, D.C., and in Chesapeake Bay there were 2 blimps, 40 airplanes, and a flotilla of naval ships to welcome the hero back to American soil. When the Memphis docked at the Navy Yard in Washington, the first person to be escorted up the gangplank was Mrs. Lindbergh, anxious for a reunion with her son. Lindbergh was aware of the potential his successful flight had given him. His celebrity could be put to use, and as far as he was concerned, the best possible use was the promotion of aviation to America and to the world. Compared with the wild scenes in Paris and London, Lindbergh's reception in Washington was restrained, but no less enthusiastic. At the Washington Monument, he was welcomed by President Coolidge and the power elite of the nation's capital. The humble mail pilot had been elevated to a place of highest honor. President Coolidge presented him with the first Distinguished Flying Cross. In response to his country's honor, Charles Lindbergh made a speech that moved at least one member of the huge crowd to tears. It was a moment to fill the heart of any mother, especially one as proud of her son as Mrs. Lindbergh. In New York, a harbor packed with every conceivable watercraft waited for Lindbergh to arrive from Washington. He descended among the crowd in a loaning amphibian and risked his neck once again in transferring to the Mekong, which carried the mayor's reception committee. At this point, he appears to have been in more danger of drowning than at any time in his transatlantic flight. Equilibrium regained, he faced a welcome of a magnitude never before seen in America. There was a snowstorm of ticker tape on Lower Broadway. Every New Yorker who could find a space on the sidewalk or a place in a window waited for Lindbergh to pass so they could express their appreciation of his achievement. Just over a month ago, Lindbergh flew into this city as the unlikely contender in the race to be first across the Atlantic. On a dismal morning 3 weeks ago, he took off from Roosevelt Field, watched by only a few hundred hardy spectators. Now Lindbergh has returned as the conquering hero. Although he failed to register his transatlantic attempt on time to qualify for the prize, he has given it anyway. He is $25,000 richer, and he is carried in triumph to New York City Hall and presented with the city's Medal of Valor by Mayor Walker. Just 3 weeks ago, he was alone above the Atlantic in the Spirit of St. Louis. Now this quiet and modest man is surrounded by more people than he has ever seen in his life. On Fifth Avenue, there's wild celebration. In Central Park, Governor Smith presents Lindbergh with the state's Medal of Valor. Charles Lindbergh now does something remarkable. Having earned his legendary status, he seizes the moment to further his vision of a world in which air travel is an everyday thing. He realizes that he has acquired power to fire the imagination of the public and give the development of air transportation a momentum it has never had before. So in July 1927, he sets out in the Spirit of St. Louis again on a solo journey of much greater length than his Atlantic crossing. Sponsored by Harry Guggenheim, Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis leave New York to fly around America. He has 68 overnight stops. The skill he acquired as a male pilot and barnstormer is exercised to the full in getting in and out of tiny, unfamiliar airfields. On September 21st, he returns to the Spirit of St. Louis's birthplace, San Diego. By the time he returns to New York, he has covered 22,000 miles in 3 months. He has remained on schedule and accident-free. It is his second great flight of 1927. But before the end of the year, he leaves on a third. He flies nonstop overnight to Mexico City in 27.25 hours and makes a goodwill tour around the Caribbean. The flags of the countries he visits are painted on the Spirit of St. Louis. When he returns to Washington in April 1928, he presents his airplane to the Smithsonian Institution.
Within a year of the flight, they brought out a new edition of the Handbook for Boys, the Boy Scouts Handbook. And there was George Washington, Daniel Boone, and Charles Lindbergh. You know, he just represented that progression to people of the American, sort of the extension of the American spirit into this new machine age.
A Lindbergh industry develops. This is the collection of Willis M. Allen of San Diego. It gives some idea of the variety of Lindbergh-related merchandise that followed the flight. Lindbergh's American tour helped reinforce the growing public awareness that air transportation was gaining a degree of reliability not associated with flying aces and barnstormers. Already, the Air Commerce Act was in place, and government was supporting the growing aviation industry. Now Lindbergh encouraged the citizens of America to develop an interest in flying. He argued that railways and highways were no longer enough. Towns with airports would outstrip the development of those without them. The mail service was already established. Commercial domestic passenger service would follow, and then in 10 to 15 years, transatlantic air services would become a reality. And what of the San Diego end of the story? Franklin B. Mahoney's company was so flooded with orders for airplanes like the Spirit of St. Louis, it couldn't satisfy the demand. He attempted to produce his Spirit of St. Louis civil version, the Brougham, at the rate of 1 a day. He could have sold 5 times as many as that. But Mahoney had never been far away from bankruptcy with Ryan Airlines, and he wasn't a great businessman. In spite of his shaky finances, in April 1928, he presented a brand new Ryan B-1X Brougham to Charles Lindbergh. Shortly afterwards, Mahoney sold his company to a group of St. Louis businessmen, including some of Lindbergh's original backers.
People have asked, you know, if it had been someone else making that flight, someone who didn't look quite so perfect, would everything that happened to Lindbergh have happened to that person? I think the answer is probably not. I think Lindbergh's character and his personality were very much a part of the excitement that grew around that achievement, that flight.
The Spirit of St. Louis now hangs in the Milestones of Flight Gallery at the National Air and Space Museum, a reminder of the vision and courage of Charles Lindbergh.